You ever hear a chainsaw and know, instantly, that something you can't replace is about to disappear? The sound hit first, sharp and mechanical, tearing through the quiet morning air like it didn't belong there. And then came the smell, fresh-cut wood, wet and raw, drifting across my porch before I even opened the door, and by the time my boots hit the gravel, I already knew it was too late. I rounded the corner of my property line and stopped cold, because where there used to be a wall of oak and cedar, 30 years of growth, shade, and silence, there was nothing but stumps, clean and flat-like. Someone had erased them with a ruler, the ground littered with sawdust that still clung to the air like smoke, and beyond it, stretching out in perfect, arrogant clarity, was the view they wanted, rows of identical rooftops from the Willow Ridge HOA, gleaming in the sunlight like they'd just claimed a prize. I could hear the last engine winding down, that high-pitched whine fading into a low idle before shutting off completely. And the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise, like the land itself was holding its breath. I stepped forward, slow, each crunch of gravel louder than it should have been, and ran my hand across one of the stumps. The surface still warm, the rings tight and deliberate. My dad used to say you could read a tree's life if you knew what to look for, and standing there, I could almost hear his voice, steady and patient, telling me where the drought years were, where the storms had passed through, where the growth had slowed and then surged back stronger. Those trees weren't just landscaping. They were the reason I bought this land in the first place, a natural barrier from the world, a line between quiet and everything else, and now that line was gone. I didn't have to guess who did it, not when I saw the tire tracks, wide, fresh, leading straight back toward the HOA boundary, not when I spotted the bright orange survey flags they'd hammered into the ground like they owned it, and definitely not when I noticed the way the hillside looked, wrong. Like something underneath had been disturbed, the soil looser than it should have been, the roots that used to hold everything together now ripped out and left to dry in the sun. A breeze rolled through, carrying that same sharp scent of sap and dust, and for a second, all I could think about was how quiet it felt without the leaves, no rustle, no shade shifting across the ground, just open air and exposure, exactly what they wanted. I pulled out my phone, not to call anyone yet, just to take it in through a screen, because sometimes distance makes things clearer, and that's when I saw it. The angle, the slope, the way the land dropped from my property down toward their main access road, the only road in and out of that entire subdivision, a narrow strip of asphalt that cut through the base of the hill like it had always been there, like it was permanent. But I knew better, because I'd walked that boundary line when I first bought the place, boots sinking into this exact soil, reading every inch of the survey like it mattered. Because it did. The memory came back fast, clean, like flipping a switch, property lines, easements, maintenance clauses, all the fine print most people ignore, and standing there with the smell of fresh-cut wood still burning in my nose, I realized something that made the silence feel a whole lot louder. They didn't just take my trees, they touched the one thing holding their perfect little neighborhood together, and they had no idea what they'd just set in motion. I did not call anyone that morning, not the police, not a lawyer, not even the county office, because I have learned something over the years working construction sites and reading land surveys in 100-degree heat, and that is this. When something feels wrong at first glance, it usually gets worse the closer you look. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked the full length of the cleared line, measuring it out step by step the way my dad taught me, slow and deliberate, counting distance without needing a tape. And the further I went, the more the damage revealed itself. Not just the missing trees but the torn earth, the shallow grooves where heavy equipment had dragged through roots that used to run deep and hold everything in place, and every now and then my boot would sink just a little too far into soil that used to be firm, packed tight from decades of growth. The air still carried that mix of sap and diesel, and underneath it there was something else now, a faint dampness, like the ground had been opened up and was not sure how to close again. I crouched near the edge where my property sloped downward, brushing loose dirt between my fingers, feeling how it crumbled too easily, and I could already picture what a hard rain would do to this hill, how water would run faster now without roots to slow it down, how it would pull at the soil and carry it downhill inch by inch until something gave way. That was when I heard it, the soft hum of an electric golf cart coming up from the direction of the subdivision, steady and self-important, like it belonged everywhere it rolled, and I did not have to turn around to know who it was. But I did anyway, wiping my hands on my jeans as Rebecca Holloway pulled up and stopped just short of the property line, her sunglasses reflecting the empty stretch of land like she was admiring a renovation. She stepped out slow, heels clicking against the gravel in a way that sounded almost rehearsed, and smiled that kind of tight, polished smile that never reaches the eyes, the kind that says the decision has already been made and your opinion is just background noise. She told me the trees had been classified as obstructive vegetation under the Community Enhancement Guidelines, her voice smooth and controlled, like she was explaining a minor upgrade instead of erasing 3 decades of growth. And she gestured behind her toward the houses now fully visible through the gap, talking about increased property values and improved sightlines, using words that sounded expensive but meant nothing standing there in the dirt. I asked her if she had ever actually read the survey boundaries, and for a second her smile flickered, just enough to tell me she had not. But she recovered fast, mentioning permits and approvals and committees, stacking authority on top of authority like it made the ground beneath her any more solid. The wind shifted again, carrying dust across the slope, and I watched it move downhill in a thin, drifting line that traced the exact path gravity would take the first time the sky opened up, and I realized she was not looking at the land the way I was. She was looking past it, through it, at something she thought she had already secured. She said if I had concerns I could file a formal complaint with the HOA board, her tone turning just a shade cooler, like she had moved from explanation to procedure. And then she added that any further interference with community improvements could result in fines, the word hanging there between us like it carried weight. I nodded once, slow, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to think she had the upper hand. And then I stepped aside and pointed down the hill, not at the road itself, but at the ground beneath it, the narrow strip where asphalt met earth, where everything depended on what you could not see from a distance. And I told her she might want to take a closer look at what those trees were actually doing, before she decided they were in the way. But she just glanced, quick and dismissive, like she was humoring me. And then she smiled again, sharper this time, and said the engineers had already signed off on everything. The cart hummed back to life as she turned away, rolling off with that same quiet confidence, leaving me standing there with the smell of fresh wood still in the air and the faint sound of gravel settling under her tires. And as the noise faded, I looked down at the slope one more time, at the loose soil, at the exposed lines where roots used to run, and I could almost see the future laid out in front of me. Not loud, not dramatic, just inevitable, like gravity doing exactly what it always does when something stops holding it back. That night the air felt different, heavier somehow, like the land was still adjusting to what had been taken from it. And I could not shake the way the hillside looked under the fading light, exposed and unsettled. So I grabbed a flashlight and walked it again, slower this time, tracing the slope from the top down to where it met the edge of that narrow access road, the beam cutting across loose soil and broken root systems that used to run like veins beneath the surface. Every step gave me more confirmation of what I already knew but needed to prove to myself. The ground was no longer anchored the way it had been for decades. And the deeper I looked, the more obvious it became that whatever engineer Rebecca claimed had approved this never set foot on this land. Because no one who understood soil stability would sign off on stripping that kind of natural reinforcement from a hillside that fed directly into a load-bearing roadway. I crouched near the base, brushing aside dirt until I exposed a section where the soil had already started to shift, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to see the pattern forming. The beginning of something that does not stop once it starts. And I pulled out my phone, snapping photos from multiple angles, documenting everything with the same methodical approach I used on job sites. Because documentation beats opinion every time. The next morning the smell of coffee filled my kitchen, but it did nothing to cut through the lingering scent of fresh wood that still seemed to cling to the air outside. And I spread out my property documents across the table, thick stacks of paper worn at the edges from years of being referenced, but never ignored. The original survey, the deed, the easement agreements, every line and clause that defined what was mine and what was not. And I read them again, slowly, like I was looking for something I might have missed the first time. The sunlight coming through the window hit the pages just right, highlighting the boundary lines in a way that made them feel less like ink and more like something fixed and immovable. And there it was again, clear as day, the access road that fed into Willow Ridge, the only entry and exit point for every house in that development, was not owned by the HOA, not by the county, not by any shared entity. It sat entirely within my property lines with a limited use easement that granted them passage. Not control, not ownership, just permission. I leaned back in my chair, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, and let that settle in, because permission can be changed, modified, even revoked under the right conditions, especially when safety becomes a factor, and safety was exactly what they had compromised the moment those trees came down. I drove out to the county records office just after noon, the kind of building that smells like old paper and floor polish, where the air conditioning hums a little too loud and every step echoes off tile floors, and I requested the original filings tied to my parcel, watching as the clerk disappeared into the back and returned with folders that had not been touched in years, dust clinging to the edges like time itself had settled there. Flipping through those documents felt like digging through layers of history, signatures from decades ago, permits, annotations, notes from surveyors who had walked this same ground long before any of those houses existed. And buried in that stack was the confirmation I needed, not just that the road crossed my land, but that its maintenance and structural integrity depended entirely on the surrounding terrain that had just been altered without authorization. The realization did not come with anger. It came with clarity, the kind that settles in your chest and steadies your breathing. Because this was no longer about what they had taken, it was about what they had exposed, a weakness they created and did not understand, and more importantly, a responsibility they had just handed back to me whether they realized it or not. When I stepped back outside, the afternoon sun was sharp, the heat rising off the pavement in soft waves, and I could see cars moving in and out of that subdivision in the distance, completely unaware of how much they depended on a strip of land they did not own, a strip of land that was now tied directly to a problem they had created with their own hands. And as I stood there with the folder tucked under my arm, feeling the weight of paper that carried more authority than any HOA notice ever could, I knew I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to argue or threaten or chase them through meetings and complaints, because everything I needed was already written down, already signed, already waiting for the right moment to be used. And all that was left now was deciding exactly when to act. By the third day, the smell of fresh cut wood had faded, replaced by something drier, dustier, like the land was starting to settle into its new reality. And I could see the change in the slope without even trying, small shifts at first, a faint line where soil had moved downhill just enough to catch your eye if you knew what to look for. And I did, because I had spent years studying how ground behaves when you remove what holds it together. The morning air carried a light breeze that pushed loose dirt across the surface in thin trails, and every time it happened, I could almost trace the future path it would take when the first real storm rolled through, straight down toward that narrow strip of asphalt they depended on. The same strip I had walked 100 times before, but now saw differently, not as a road, but as a pressure point. I drove out just after sunrise, tires humming low against the pavement, and parked along the edge where my property line met the entrance, stepping out into that quiet moment before the neighborhood fully woke up, when sprinklers clicked on in rhythmic bursts and the smell of wet grass mixed with the faint heat of warming concrete. And I stood there watching the water run, thin streams finding their way along the curb, slipping into cracks and seams that had always been there but never mattered, not until now. I crouched down again, running my hand along the edge where asphalt met soil, feeling how the boundary had softened, how the dirt no longer held tight against the roadbed. And I did not need a report or a second opinion to understand what that meant, because I had seen it before on job sites where shortcuts were taken and the land always collected its due. Later that morning, I made the calls, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet conversations with the county office, the kind where you ask specific questions and listen carefully to the answers, confirming what I already suspected about easement rights, maintenance, responsibilities, and what happens when the underlying conditions of a shared access point are compromised. And every answer came back the same way, measured and precise, pointing to one simple truth, that the moment safety becomes a concern, The property owner has both the right and the obligation to act. By midday, I was back at my table, documents spread out again. But this time I was not searching, I was organizing, marking sections, highlighting clauses, building a sequence that made sense not just on paper but in practice. Because this was not about confrontation. It was about timing. The afternoon heat settled in heavy, pressing against the windows as I stepped outside once more, walking the line where the trees used to stand, now nothing but open sky and exposed ground. And I could hear the neighborhood behind me coming to life. Car doors closing, engines starting, the distant echo of voices carrying across a space that used to be buffered by leaves and branches. And it struck me how much louder everything felt without that natural barrier, how exposed they had made themselves without realizing it. I watched as a line of vehicles moved along that road, each one depending on a surface that looked solid but was slowly losing the support it needed to stay that way. And I thought about Rebecca's confidence, the way she stood there talking about improvements and approvals like the land answered to paperwork instead of physics. And I almost understood it, because from a distance everything still looked fine, smooth pavement, clean lines, nothing visibly wrong. But I knew better, because I had seen what was underneath. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the slope, I walked back up to where the first tree had been cut, standing there in the quiet, feeling the dry soil shift slightly under my weight, and I realized something that settled everything into place. This was never going to be about proving them wrong in a meeting or arguing over definitions in a document. This was about letting the reality they created unfold exactly as it was designed to. And when it did, I would be ready, not with anger, not with noise, but with the kind of response that does not need to be explained, because it speaks for itself the moment it happens. The first letter showed up in my mailbox late that afternoon, thick paper, official seal, the kind that tries to look more important than it actually is, and I could feel the weight of it before I even opened it, the faint smell of ink and fresh print hitting me as I unfolded it slowly, reading every line the way I always do, calm and deliberate. And there it was exactly as expected, a formal notice from the HOA citing unauthorized interference with community improvements, warning of escalating fines and possible legal action if I continued to challenge what they called a completed and approved project. I leaned against the porch railing, the wood warm under my hands from the sun, and read it again, not because I needed to, but because repetition has a way of revealing intention, and the intention here was clear: pressure, intimidation, the assumption that I would fold the way most people do when faced with official language and potential cost. A car passed by on the road below, tires humming steady against asphalt that still looked perfectly intact from a distance, and I watched it go, thinking about how easy it is to trust what you see on the surface, how most people never question what lies underneath until something forces them to. I set the letter down on the railing and walked the slope again, slower this time, paying attention to the small details, the way the soil had begun to form faint channels where water would eventually run, the way loose particles gathered along the edge of the road like a quiet warning, and I did not need a storm yet to know what would happen when one came. I could already see the pattern forming, gradual, patient, inevitable. The next morning brought a second letter, this one more direct, citing specific dollar amounts, daily penalties that would accumulate if I did not comply, and I could almost hear Rebecca's voice behind it, controlled and confident, convinced that numbers on paper could outweigh what was happening right there in the ground. And I let out a slow breath, folding the notice neatly and placing it on the table with the others, because this was exactly the response I expected: escalation without understanding. I drove into town just after that, the sun already high, heat rising off the pavement in soft waves that blurred the horizon, and stopped by a local engineering office I had worked with years before, not for a formal consultation, just a conversation, the kind where you lay out a scenario and listen to someone who understands soil, load, and time. And the answer I got was quiet but certain: remove root systems from a slope like that, and you do not get immediate failure. You get delayed movement, subtle at first, then progressive, and when it reaches a threshold, it does not ask permission, it just follows gravity. I thanked him, stepped back out into the bright afternoon, and stood there for a moment, letting the heat and the hum of distant traffic settle around me, because everything was aligning exactly the way it should, not forced, not rushed, just unfolding. When I got back home, there was a third envelope waiting. This one hand-delivered, and I did not need to open it to know what it said. The pattern was already established, pressure building from their side while the ground beneath them slowly shifted in ways they could not see. I walked past the mailbox without stopping, heading straight for the edge of the property, where the open space still felt wrong without the trees, the air moving differently now, carrying sound farther than it used to. And I stood there looking down at the road, at the steady flow of cars, at the confidence in every movement. And I realized something that settled everything into place. They were trying to control the situation with paperwork and deadlines. But they had already lost control the moment they changed the land itself, because paper does not hold soil, and deadlines do not stop gravity. And for the first time since the chainsaw started, I allowed myself a small, quiet moment of certainty, not because I needed to win an argument, but because I knew I did not have to. All I had to do was wait for the right conditions. And when they came, I would already have everything in place. The weather forecast changed 2 days later, not dramatically, just a quiet update on my phone that most people would scroll past without a second thought, a line of gray icons stretching across the next 48 hours with percentages that kept climbing, 60, then 70, then 80% chance of sustained rainfall. And I stood there on my porch watching the sky shift from clear blue to something heavier, clouds rolling in low and slow like they had nowhere else to be. And I could already smell it before the first drop fell, that faint metallic scent that rides the air right before a storm settles in. The wind picked up just enough to move loose dust across the cleared slope, thin trails of dirt sliding downhill in patterns I had been watching form for days. And I walked the edge one more time, boots pressing into soil that no longer pushed back the way it used to, each step sinking just slightly, just enough to confirm everything I had been tracking. And when the first drops finally hit, they were light at first, scattered taps against the ground, darkening the dirt in uneven patches that spread outward slowly. I stayed there as it built, the sound changing from individual drops to a steady rhythm, soft at first and then more consistent, water finding its way along every loose channel, tracing lines that had not existed a week ago. And I watched as those lines deepened, pulling fine particles with them, carrying them downhill in quiet, continuous motion. By evening, the rain had settled into something steady, not violent, not dramatic, just persistent, the kind that does not need intensity to do its work. And I stood under the edge of the porch roof listening to it hit the ground, that constant hiss of water meeting exposed soil. And every now and then I could hear a faint shift, a soft sliding sound as sections of dirt adjusted under the weight of moisture, almost too subtle to notice unless you were listening for it. The next morning the air was thick and damp, the smell of wet earth rising strong enough to taste, and I walked out early, before the neighborhood fully woke up, before the usual sounds of engines and voices filled the space. And what I saw was exactly what I had expected. The slope had changed, not dramatically enough for anyone passing by to panic, but enough that the lines were no longer where they had been, shallow grooves now deeper, small ridges forming where soil had collected. And at the base, right along the edge of that road, a thin layer of sediment had begun to settle against the asphalt like a quiet warning. I crouched down again, running my fingers along the edge, feeling how the boundary had softened further overnight, the soil no longer compact, no longer anchored, and I could see where water had slipped underneath in places. Subtle undermining that does not announce itself until it reaches a point where it cannot hold anymore. A car drove by then, slower than usual, the tires making a slightly different sound against the surface, not enough to alarm anyone. Just a change in tone that only stands out if you know what it used to sound like. And I watched it pass. Watched the driver continue on without a second glance, unaware of what was happening just inches below. By midday the rain picked up again, steady sheets now, water running continuously down the slope, and I could see the movement accelerating, soil shifting more freely, small sections sliding just enough to expose darker layers beneath. And I stepped back, not interfering, not trying to stop anything. Because this was not something you fight against once it starts. This is something you understand and prepare for. The sound of rain hitting the road below blended with the low hum of tires, a constant background noise that masked the subtle changes taking place underneath. And I realized how perfectly it all aligned, not because I forced it, but because they had set it in motion the moment they removed what was holding everything together. And as I stood there watching water carve its path through the ground they thought they had improved, I felt that same quiet certainty settle in again, not rushed, not emotional, just clear, because now it was no longer a question of if anything would happen, it was only a matter of when, and when that moment came, I would already be exactly where I needed to be. By the second night the rain did not stop, it settled into that steady, relentless rhythm that fills every space with sound, tapping against the roof, soaking into the ground, turning what used to be firm into something softer with every passing hour, and I stood by the window watching the slope under the dim glow of a porch light. The surface no longer smooth but textured now, marked by thin channels that had widened into shallow cuts, water flowing through them like it had found a path it planned to keep. The air smelled heavy, saturated with wet earth and something faintly metallic, and every now and then there was a subtle shift, a quiet settling sound that you would miss if you were not listening for it. But I was, because I knew exactly what those sounds meant, the ground adjusting, redistributing, moving in ways that could not be reversed once they started. By early morning the rain eased just enough to reveal what had changed overnight, and I stepped outside, boots sinking deeper this time, the soil no longer resisting, each step leaving a clear imprint that filled slowly with water, and as I walked the line again, I could see the progression. The slope had lost more of its structure, sections where the top layer had slipped just enough to expose darker, wetter soil beneath, and down at the base. The edge of the road looked different now, not broken, not damaged in any obvious way, but subtly altered, the line between asphalt and earth no longer clean, small ridges of sediment pressed up against it like a quiet buildup of pressure. I crouched low, running my hand along that edge, feeling how the ground gave slightly under my fingers, how the support that used to be there had thinned, and I did not need to measure anything to understand what that meant. The road was still holding, but it was no longer resting on the same foundation it had been designed for. A truck passed by slowly, the tires making a duller sound than before, and I watched the way the water shifted slightly with the weight, small ripples forming where there should have been none, and that was enough, not dramatic, not alarming to anyone else, but enough for me. I stood up, brushing wet soil from my hands, and walked back toward the house, the rain picking up again behind me, soft at first, then steady, like it had settled in for another round. Inside, the air felt dry compared to outside, the quiet hum of the room. Grounding everything as I laid out the documents again, not searching this time, just confirming, aligning what I was seeing with what was written, the easement terms, the maintenance clauses, the responsibilities tied to safety and structural integrity, and it all pointed in one direction, clear and direct. If the conditions supporting access were compromised, the property owner had both the right and the obligation to restrict use until it was safe again. I sat there for a moment, listening to the rain against the windows, feeling the weight of that realization settle in, not as a decision, but as a next step that had already been set in motion days ago. By midday the rain had slowed again, leaving behind a damp, heavy stillness, and I walked back out one more time, this time stopping at the point where the road met my property, looking down its length as cars continued to move through, slower now, more cautious without even realizing why. And I could see it clearly, the subtle unevenness, the way the surface no longer sat perfectly level, the kind of change that builds quietly until it cannot be ignored anymore. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, not to call anyone in a rush, but to make the right call at the right time, contacting the county office again, requesting a formal inspection based on observed changes to soil stability and potential risk to access infrastructure. My voice calm, precise, laying out facts instead of opinions, and when I ended the call, I stood there for a moment longer, watching the road, listening to the fading sound of tires moving through water, and I realized something that felt almost inevitable now. They had tried to take control by removing what they thought was in their way, but all they had really done was remove the one thing that kept everything else in place. And now, with the ground shifting and the evidence building with every drop of rain, I was no longer waiting. I was simply allowing the process to reach the point where action was not just justified, it was required. The county truck showed up just after sunrise, its engine idling low as it rolled to a stop near the edge of the road, tires pressing into damp asphalt that still held a sheen from the night's rain, and I stood a few yards back, hands in my pockets, watching two inspectors step out with clipboards and measuring tools, their boots hitting the ground with that solid, practiced confidence of people who have seen this kind of situation before. The air was cool, heavy with the smell of wet soil and fading rain, and there was a quiet tension in the way everything felt, like the land itself was waiting to be acknowledged for what it had already started doing. They walked the line slowly, one of them crouching near the base where the slope met the road, brushing aside sediment with a gloved hand, exposing the softened edge underneath, while the other took photos, angles precise, documenting the subtle shifts that most people would overlook, but that meant everything in a report. I could hear the faint scratch of pen against paper as notes were taken, short, efficient movements that carried more weight than any HOA letter ever sent. And when one of them stood up and looked back along the slope, following the path where the trees used to stand, I saw it in his expression, not surprise, not confusion, just recognition, the kind that comes from understanding exactly how cause and effect play out over time. By mid-morning the rain had fully stopped, leaving behind a damp stillness that made every sound sharper, the distant hum of a car approaching, the soft drip of water falling from exposed soil, and I watched as the inspectors moved down the length of the road, checking points along the edge, measuring slight variations that had already begun to form in the surface. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines, but enough to shift the conversation from opinion to fact. When they finished, one of them walked over to me, his boots leaving clear impressions in the softened ground, and he spoke in that calm, measured tone professionals use when they do not need to exaggerate, explaining that while the road was still passable, the underlying support had been compromised, that continued use under current conditions could accelerate instability, and that until proper reinforcement or restoration measures were taken, restricting access would be the safest course of action. I nodded once, the words settling in exactly where I expected them to, not as a surprise, but as confirmation, and when he handed me the preliminary notice, the paper felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, authority grounded in observation, not assumption. By early afternoon the signs went up, bright and unmistakable, placed at the entrance where the road met my property, their presence cutting through the normal flow of movement like a quiet interruption that could not be ignored, and I stood off to the side as the first car approached, slowing down as the driver read the notice, confusion visible even from a distance as they came to a complete stop, engine idling, unsure for a moment before turning around. One by one it happened again, vehicles pulling up, pausing, then reversing course. The usual rhythm of the neighborhood disrupted not by force, but by a simple shift in what was allowed, and I watched it unfold with a steady calm, the sound of engines changing direction replacing the usual steady flow forward. By late afternoon the silence settled in where constant movement used to be, the road empty except for the faint tracks left behind in damp conditions, and I could see figures gathering in the distance near the entrance, small clusters of residents trying to understand what had changed, their voices carrying faintly across the open space that used to be buffered by trees, now exposed, every sound traveling farther than before. I did not move toward them, did not raise my voice or make any announcement, because there was nothing to explain that had not already been written down, nothing to argue that had not already been observed. And as I stood there looking at the quiet stretch of road, the damp air settling around me, I realized how complete the shift had become, not sudden, not loud, but absolute in its effect. Because the same ground they thought they had improved had now become the reason everything had to stop, and all I had done was let the truth of it come to the surface. Rebecca did not come quietly, she never did, and I heard her before I saw her, the sharp click of heels against asphalt echoing across the empty stretch of road that had not seen a single car pass through since the signs went up, her voice already raised, cutting through the still air like she was trying to force movement back into a place that had already decided to stop. I stayed where I was, near the edge of the property, hands resting easy at my sides, watching as she approached with that same controlled intensity, except now there was something different underneath it, something tighter, like confidence stretched just a little too thin. The air was dry again, the rain finally gone, but the ground still held its softness, the slope behind me marked with every shift that had taken place, visible now in ways that could not be ignored. And as she reached the sign and read it again, slower this time, I could see the realization starting to settle in, not all at once, but in pieces, like she was trying to rearrange the situation into something she could still control. She turned toward me, demanding explanations, citing approvals and committees and everything she had relied on before, her voice sharp, but not as steady as it had been days ago. And I let her speak, not interrupting, not reacting, just listening the way I had from the beginning, because this was not a conversation I needed to win. It was one that had already been decided. When she finished, I stepped forward just enough to close the distance, the gravel shifting softly under my boots, and I handed her the notice from the county, the paper catching the light as she took it, her fingers tightening slightly as she read, her eyes moving faster now, scanning lines that did not leave room for interpretation. Words like compromised stability, restricted access, and property owner responsibility carrying more weight than anything she had brought with her. The wind picked up just enough to move across the open space where the trees used to stand, carrying sound farther than it ever had before. And in that moment, there was no barrier between us, no shade, no buffer, just open ground and the truth of what had happened laid out in front of both of us. She looked up again, searching for something to push back with, something to regain control, but there was nothing left to argue, because this was no longer about rules or preferences or what someone wanted to see from their window. This was about what the land would allow and what it would not, and the land had already made its decision. I told her calmly that access would remain restricted until the slope was stabilized and the underlying support restored, that any work would have to be done properly this time, with full accountability, and that until then, the road was not safe for regular use. Every word measured, every statement grounded in what had already been documented. She stood there for a moment longer, the silence stretching between us, the weight of it settling in as the reality became clear, not just to her, but to everyone watching from a distance. The small groups of residents gathered at the edge of what used to be their normal routine, now interrupted by something they could not ignore. I stepped back then, giving space without yielding anything, and watched as she turned away, slower than before, the sound of her steps softer now, less certain, fading into the quiet that had taken over the entire stretch of road. The sun broke through the clouds just enough to cast light across the slope, highlighting every line, every shift, every detail that told the story better than any explanation could. And I stood there for a moment, taking it in, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a steady understanding of how it all came together. They had removed what they thought was in their way, and in doing so, they had uncovered exactly what was holding everything else together. And now, with the road silent, and the view wide open just like they wanted, the only thing left was the consequence of that choice, sitting right there in plain sight, quiet, undeniable, and entirely